Joining us now is Nadia Whittome, Labour MP for Nottingham East since 2019. She's been outspoken on the cost of living, the climate crisis, care work and LGBTQ plus rights.
Nadia has also just told us she needed to mute the Zoom to blow her nose, and also was scrambling around looking for her AirPods. So it's another day in the life of Britain's most relatable MP. Having to mute a Zoom to blow your nose and frantically searching for AirPods is the kind of thing that the average British person can really connect with, I think.
And then finding them in the place that you were looking.
Nadia, last time we spoke to you, you were in opposition and you were still the baby of the house. And now you're in government and you're essentially at this point a sort of political veteran. How does it feel to have made that transition to being the party in power?
Yeah, I mean, it feels weird to be described as like a veteran Gen Z MP when I've just turned 28.
Yeah, that's a lot of seemingly contradictory terms. It's like you and Billie Eilish are the veteran Gen Zs.
That's so nice to be in the same category as Billie Eilish. I think that's incredibly generous. But yeah, how does it feel? It's obviously it feels very different. For a start, most of the MPs are new MPs. So it's like having to get to know loads of new people, loads of new faces, not knowing whether it's a new Tory MP or a new Labour MP. Obviously, the chances are it will be a new Labour MP. But if I hosted a reception in Parliament yesterday with school children about decarbonising education and climate education. And we were bringing around with us this little book and flicking through to see who the MPs were. It's there are 650, we need to hurry up.
Okay. Nadia, I have to give you my tip, right? So basically, if you're in a situation and you're talking to an MP and you don't know their name, you go, so sorry, what's your name again? And then they'll say, I'm Roger Moore. It's not Roger Moore. I don't know why I said that.
Roger Moore was the first name you could think of.
It was the first thing that came to my mind.
I don't know whether it's just the power of gaslighting, but I think there might be an MP called Roger Moore.
So then they say, oh, I'm Roger Moore. And you go, oh, Roger, of course I knew you were it was the last name. And then you finesse it. Anyway, you can have that for free, Nadia.
Oh, that's a good one. What I used to do when I first started before was I'd say, if I was talking to a male MP, a white male MP, which
you'd call him Matt.
Yeah.
You'd say John. You'd just guess
I'd
Sam.
go, it's John, isn't it? And they'd say, oh no, it's not John, it's Robert. And I'd say, oh, Robert, of course. But sometimes it would be John and they'd just say yes.
Oh God, I feel like this could be dangerous.
Listen, I'm very happy to be part of this. I would definitely enjoy you two presenting a sort of life hacks podcast for people who struggle to remember other people's names.
Oh God. Oh, apparently we've had a note from the producer. There's a Robbie Moore, the Conservative MP for Keighley and Ilkley. So maybe you're thinking of him.
Who's that and where's that?
Oh my God.
Okay.
That's definitely Yorkshire, but I can't help you with who Robbie Moore is.
I don't know who Robbie Moore is. Anyway, I think we revealed something there.
You definitely revealed something there. You think all white men are called Roger Moore.
Some of my best friends are white, actually.
Yeah.
And if you go far back enough, some of my ancestors are white from colonialism. So,
yes, you tell him.
So, listen, it's been a sort of summer of nonsense on any number of levels, but Parliament's back in session. There's a massive Labour majority. In terms of positive things, as we record on the Wednesday, Rachel Reeves has signalled that she will change the government's borrowing rules to allow more investment, but whilst not raising taxes. How are you reacting to that news, Nadia? Presumably, it's something to be celebrated, this idea that she's moving away from those stringent rules about borrowing, because it actually means there's going to be able to be some money to be invested into the country.
Yeah, this is absolutely a positive sign. We can't be so strictly wedded to a set of fiscal rules that the government can't make decisions to improve people's lives. It's something that governments have to do, borrow to invest. That makes economic sense. I think the Conservatives sold us this myth over the last 10, 15 years that government spending was like a household budget and you don't spend what you don't have. But actually, governments have to borrow to invest in our public services. And that not just improves people's lives, most importantly, but it also, if you're talking about economic growth, it grows the economy too.
Is your hope now, presumably, that this idea of no new tax rises, the manifesto commitment, some of the language during the campaign was, I think it's fair to say, like deliberately vague around what the phrase no new tax rises would mean. Presumably, given your interest in a wealth tax, that's something you're going to be actively pushing the government towards.
Absolutely. I mean, we all understand that the new Labour government has inherited a huge economic mess from the Tories, and that's resulted in big spending pressures on the new government. But we have to be clear that further cuts will not help fix our broken society. We need more public spending, not less. And actually, austerity is not an inevitability. The government does have other choices. So we have a lot of wealth in this country, but the problem is it's concentrated in the hands of the few. So we've got super rich individuals hoarding extreme amounts of money and assets. I was really shocked when I looked up the statistic that we have 165 billionaires in the UK. And I find it difficult to even comprehend that level of wealth. I think most of us do. But if you spent £1,000 every day, guess how long it would take you to spend £1 billion?
I'll be dead.
Yeah.
Will I be dead?
Oh, long dead.
Okay.
And your grandchildren would be dead and their grandchildren.
Wow. Okay.
So
Wow.
And there's
sobering thought for a Wednesday morning.
2,740 years
Wow.
it would take you to spend £1 billion if you spent £1,000 every day. So that's just an illustration of what obscene wealth we're talking about. And if the government introduced even very moderate wealth taxes, like, for example, a tax of 2% at a threshold of £10 million a year, so that would mean you can keep everything that you have up to 10 million. I say you, I obviously don't literally mean you or me or any of us.
I can assure you,
listening to
Nadia, if
this
I'm
podcast.
spending £1,000 a day, I'm dead in a week. Trust me on that. I'm gone.
So if there was a 2% tax on wealth above £10 million, that would only impact about 20,000 of the richest people in the UK. But it would raise an estimated £22 billion a year. Think of what that money could be spent on. It could fund public services, fund building a mass programme of council house building, fund the just transition to net zero, anti-poverty measures. Also, if you equalise capital gains tax and income tax, which I know is something that you've spoken about before on the podcast,
Yeah.
it's not a radical demand. Nigel Lawson, when he was Tory Chancellor, supported this measure. That could raise up to £15 billion a year. It's a no-brainer.
I mean, listening to you now, Nadia, it sounds like there's hopeful things, low-hanging fruit that can be won, things can be changed. That sounds great, because I'll be honest, sitting here outside of the party, we're coming up to 100 days of this new government. It feels like the notes are quite doomy, a bit sort of expect the worst, things aren't going to get better. Is that how it feels inside the camp?
I've got to say that the mood is pretty subdued.
Right.
I think we were all riding on a high after the election, but that honeymoon period hasn't lasted very long. The polling's looking bad. What I'm concerned about is that we were elected on this promise of change, and I'm very worried about what will happen if we don't deliver on that. We've got the far right, and we saw them mobilising and organising across the country over the summer. They're waiting in the wings. So we have to get this right. There is too much at stake if we fail to deliver. We've got to show people how a Labour government can improve people's lives. And we've got to say very clearly that the problem for your fall in living standards is not migrants, it's not people of colour, it's not Muslims, it's not refugees, it's not trans people. It's a Tory government, exploitative bosses and landlords. And we are going to take measures to tackle those things and improve people's lives.
You mentioned the far right riots there, and there was many different things that happened to cause this hellish month of intimidation on the streets. But one thing that was part of it was disinformation on social media. Now, you are one of the most popular politicians on social media. I can imagine that is extremely challenging. Do you think this reflects where politics should be, that we should have politicians engaging with social media properly in order to curb the more malignant forces that we see coming through?
Yeah, I think that's a really big question, and there are lots of things at play here. I think we need more democracy in the media so that people aren't just hearing from a media that is controlled and owned by a couple of billionaires. Like that's the diversity that you get in a lot of the right-wing media, is that they're owned by different billionaires.
Yeah.
Not even that many different billionaires.
Are they all called John?
Some of them are called Rupert. that's the other R. Roger, Robert, and Rupert. And they say all our names sound the same.
You use TikTok very effectively to communicate around political issues. Is that do you think that's the future of political campaigning, or has the summer shown us that it can actually be quite dangerous? I would personally argue that some of Nigel Farage's interventions via social media exacerbated an already pretty horrific situation.
I mean, Reform are massive on TikTok.
Yeah.
Genuinely massive. It's quite chilling. Is it the new frontier?
I absolutely agree with what you said about Farage's interventions, and I think that the popularity of the far right on TikTok, including among young people, and especially young men and boys, is extremely worrying, especially when you've got a kind of a fertile ground for radicalisation, with people being more isolated, with people's living standards being inadequate. And that's not because people are more likely to be racist or, misogynistic, as is the case, because that's also some of the far right radicalisation, like with Andrew Tate. It's not because working class people are more likely to be racist because of their living standards. Like, racism has always come from the top of British society, but far-right groups are exploiting the very real problems of poverty and state and corporate neglect, and they're convincing people that the perpetrator is someone else. And then, as you say, they're bolstered by right-wing politicians and parts of the media who also scapegoat people, and they do that to deflect responsibility, to distract from their own failings, and crucially to divide people so that they can carry on doing that, so they can carry on making the same political choices that have screwed people over in the first place.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because it's been a big bugbear of mine, is this idea that the working class are more racist. That really winds me up. Even if you just by the crudest measure of mixed families, you tend to see them more in working class communities. So working class communities are more diverse. I think you're absolutely right that it can. Sometimes we can't solve these issues because we wrap it all up in snooty class politics, and it's really unfair, and it doesn't solve anything and doesn't make anything better.
Definitely. And I think that, when people are sharing memes saying these people have no teeth and no GCSEs, I think it's really harmful. And I don't say that from a kind of liberal perspective of not wanting to hurt people's feelings, but it misdiagnoses the problem as being coming from working class communities. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist in working class communities. Of course it does. But it's always come from the top of British society, and it's always been in the interests of the ruling class to cement it. So yeah, it misdiagnoses the problem. And then if we're not diagnosing the problem properly, how do we solve it? And how do we build a coalition of people who have the same interests, the same worries of putting food on the table, making their rent, paying their mortgage, paying the bills, if we're dividing people further.
I just want to briefly touch on something else that happened on social media. After Rosie Duffield's resignation from the Labour Party, you tweeted, no matter your views on her stated reasons for quitting, Rosie Duffield has made a political career out of dehumanising one of the most marginalised groups in society. She should never have been allowed the privilege of resigning. Labour should have withdrawn the whip long ago. And then J.K. Rowling commented on the post saying, Rosie Duffield was one of the few female Labour politicians with the guts to stand up for vulnerable women and girls, while self-satisfied numbskulls like you fought to give away their rights and spaces. Keep her name out of your mouth. Later adding, that was my first draft. Well, it was F off Nadia, but same vibe. I mean, just as on a personal level, I would say if you're trying to come across as a rational human being, probably quoting a phrase most recently popularised by Will Smith after he slapped Chris Rock might not be the most hugely sensible way of expressing that opinion. But the rhetoric around the transgender community has become incredibly toxic and hostile on social media. But Nadia, even someone like you who is, has been outspoken on this issue, were you, because I'll be honest, even I was surprised by the hostility of that response. Were you slightly taken aback by the tone of that?
I mean, I'm the only LGBT woman of colour in Parliament. I'm used to it.
Yeah.
But on J.K. Rowling, I think I just feel very sad for her. I think she's had this glittering career as a much-loved children's author, and I'm not glossing over the criticisms that many people have made around like the racist and anti-Semitic tropes in her work. But it is true that she brought a lot of joy to many people, and now this irrational hatred that she has of one of the most marginalised groups in society hasn't just damaged her own life, but of course, most importantly and most tragically, it's damaged theirs too.
Yeah, it was a very, very sort of strange incident. One of the key areas that you're passionate about, and we've already talked about the fact that yesterday you had an event in Parliament for school kids to talk about just transition to net zero. The climate crisis is something you're very vocal about. There's been another week of extreme weather warnings, citizens being evacuated from parts of Florida, and more scientific community warnings about the point that we are reaching. How are you feeling about the direction of travel on this, and how can we keep the public on side with the severity of this issue?
I think we need to be absolutely clear in the face of like the far right and right wing politicians using net zero as a culture war issue.
Yeah.
And using it as a wedge issue. And we need to say that there is no choice between tackling the climate crisis and tackling the cost of living crisis, that the perpetrators and the causes of the two are the same, and so are the solutions the same. We don't have to choose between them, and actually we can't choose between them, because the climate crisis is a class issue. It's impact, and the impact of governments failing to tackle it has been felt most harshly by working class communities. And that's not just in the global south, it's in this country as well. So I'm really heartened to see the work that Ed Miliband and his team are doing, especially around Great British Energy, because that's something that it will cut bills for good by stopping our dependence on volatile gas markets, which was all highlighted at the time that Russia invaded Ukraine. But it also creates those decent jobs that our communities need, particularly communities that have been deindustrialised, like in Nottinghamshire. It boosts incomes, it boosts our economy. It's being paid for by a windfall tax on oil and gas giants. And it's also the principle of redistribution for the common good. So we're taking the soaring profits of oil and gas firms, and we're creating with that a publicly owned energy company that will benefit everyone. I think that's a really positive start. Equally, I think retrofitting is one of the most important policies when we're talking about cutting bills, cutting carbon emissions, creating jobs. And improving people's health outcomes as well. So I'm pleased to see that as part of Labour's policy platform. But we need to go further, and we need to go faster.
Before we let you go, Nadia, I just sort of on a personal level just want to ask you, coming in 2019, being in opposition for all this time, in government now, are you enjoying yourself?
I'm really bad at lying. It's really obvious in my face and in my voice. And I wasn't prepared for the question, so I didn't even have time to come up with I'm having a laugh. Like, no, I'm not particularly enjoying myself. Yeah. But I do think that there's hope in the new government, and there is space for us to collectively put pressure on the government to make changes that would improve all of our lives. So alongside some of the good things that the government is doing, like the Renters' Rights Bill, which would massively redress the imbalance in power between landlords and tenants, the New Deal for Working People, which would be the biggest shift in power from bosses towards workers. The rest of the hope is in our collective power and action.
Well, that's a beautiful place to leave it. Thank you so much, Nadia. I'm sorry you're not having a good time, but listen, work is never fun and you're doing the work. So thank you for that. And thank you.
We don't dream of work.
Thank you for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you so much for having me.